Hey everybody, welcome to the Level Up Leadership Podcast. My name is Mike Delgado.
My name is Patty Guevara.
This podcast is designed to help gain insight into leadership skills and traits needed to grow our careers.
In this podcast, we'll talk mentorship, career navigation, handling rejection, work-life balance, mental health, diversity and inclusion, and so much more.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Today we're speaking with Abraham Jin and Jim Lee, speakers and consultants at Giant Worldwide, a global media and content development company specializing in leader transformation. If you guys can just introduce yourself to our listeners who haven't had the opportunity to be part of your workshops and just tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got here.
My name is Abraham Jin, and both Jim and I, we represent Giant Worldwide, and it's a global leadership firm, and we just have a vision to really help leaders become liberators, and we say liberators are those who know how to appropriately bring the right support, challenge, and really help people create cultures of empowerment and opportunity. And in that, as leaders become liberators in their context, we want them to be leaders worth following. And so part of my personal journey of how I engaged or I got into this field was really, I just noticed at the end of the day, whatever organizations that I worked for, two things was really important. It was really relationships, and it was the leadership. And out of that relationship and leadership, you actually create a culture. And I think that the most high-performing teams really think about culture. And so when there was an opportunity to be part of just Giant and really being able to socialize and to be able to help with leaders organizationally, that's something that I really have a passion for, and it's always been something that's very important in my journey. So.
I think relationships is key, and that's something you really touched on in today's workshops. And I was wondering, early in your career, as you began to observe different leaders and your work in the organization, how to be effective, what were some of the initial challenges you saw people had when it came to building relationships?
I think just leadership in general, it's just changed a lot in what was important a couple decades before, right? It was very much positional leadership was very important, your credentials, your resume, all the different letters behind your name. But nowadays, leadership it's not just positional leadership, it's really about relational, influential leadership. And the way you go about conducting yourself in relational leadership or influential leadership is very different from leveraging or lording over others in regards to pushing people to certain alignment or execution. It requires building trust and getting consensus and creating more agile collaborative scenarios and creating psychological safety. It requires a lot more of the soft skills and the warmth aspects of relationships. You can't just leverage your skill set of your IQ and your intelligence. If in the dawn of Google, right, you would have thought that, leadership issues would be solved because you now have all this intelligence in the world. But at the end of the day, what we find is that the leaders that really are pushing the greatest influence are the ones who really know how to move out of influential leadership versus just positional leadership.
You and Jim both use something you call the 5 voices to help people understand other people better and communicate better. Can you guys explain the 5 voices a little more?
The 5 voices is a framework that was created by Giant to make things more intuitive and simple and sticky. We say that if it's not easy to use, then people don't use it at all. And I grew up in 20 years of my leadership using Myers-Briggs type indicators, and there's a lot of controversy behind that, but not to go into too much depth on that reason. But I think the bigger controversy is not understanding how to use it, and as well as being confused on what those letters mean, and it's not sticky. So what we found is if we could describe people's tendencies and create personality types that we call voices, then I think people can be heard. And so the reality is your personality is a voice. It's a way you tend to want to communicate, whether it's body language, whether it's your voice that you speak into. And if we can use words that are more intuitive on what it describes then it's a lot more easier for people to not only relate to, but to use, to take ownership of, as well as to be able to relate better with other people. So we have 5 voices, and we call them nurturer, guardian, creative, connector, and pioneer. And they all just have a certain invocation, right, when you hear those words. And that's what makes it a lot more stickier for people to not only take ownership and relate to it, than having 4 letters that a lot of times people don't understand like what they mean or what order those letters take place into.
Right, and the workshops that we are involved in with you guys, not a lot of people are going to be able to experience that, and it's like very unique and very cool. Mike, I wanted to know like what your first impression of Abe and Jim were, and like their presentation.
Well, right off the bat, what I thought was really cool was that you started off with talking about your families, and I immediately connected to that because it kind of humanized you. And then I saw your kids and how cute they are. And as a dad, I was like, oh, these guys are cool. So I was like, I'm like a very much like a nerd. Like I'm attracted to like the nurturers. And so kind of like seeing your families and you talking about your families, like I connected immediately to that. And then when you started to introduce these 5 different voices, initially I was thinking Myers-Briggs, Enneagram stuff, like personality types, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is a different way of looking at things. Because we actually went through in our PR team about, I don't know, 6 years ago, the full Myers-Briggs analysis where everybody on the team was analyzed.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and we went through, and we actually had like a Myers-Briggs consultant like go through our results with us. But what was really funny is because we're all in PR, she was like, I've never seen everyone on the extroverted scale. Like everybody was on the extroverted scale. But even though it was really interesting to kind of like learn more about ourselves through that testing, it's so true what you said, Jim. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it.
Yeah.
Like I thought it was interesting. Like, oh, I understand myself better, and oh, isn't that interesting? But there was nothing really actionable on how to do it. So when I heard your presentation about the different personality types, these different voices. And then how these voices kind of work and why it's really important to think about these different voices because that's how we communicate with others. Like that, it was a light bulb in my head that went off.
Yeah, my first experience with you guys was during the demo, and that was when Abe kind of picked me out, and he asked me like, 5 questions? And then he totally like just told me what I was. I felt like he was reading my whole life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was just crazy. So it's kind of, interesting hearing that there are these tendencies that you have, and because of them, people can kind of peg like what you're going to act like and how you're going to speak in the workplace and whatnot. I'm kind of interested to know if you guys were just always like connector and pioneer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In my personal journey of this framework, it was really difficult for me to actually identify what my primary voices were. In fact, it took me like 6 months. The reason why is because a lot of times, when we think about our leadership behavior, our leadership voice, or finding our authentic voice, we don't know how to distinguish between the nature and the nurture and the choices that actually kind of come all together to display who you are. But if you can dissect between the nature and nurture being everything external to pressurizing you to be a certain way, whether it's your education, your vocation, your job, to your culture, to everything kind of that has been external to you to actually become a certain way. And then nature being intrinsic to kind of what are your cards that you've been dealt with that actually that you've been given from birth, right? And then choices could either agree with the nature or the nurture or something totally different, right? Well, for me, I was so enmeshed with my nurture and the different choices that I actually didn't know what my true voice was. And so it really took me a while to kind of unravel the layers for myself and to really start to identify with my true voice. And so there was a little bit of, some levels sometimes we want to perceive ourselves to be a certain way because maybe we've been modeled that because of your mom or your dad said that's the way we need to lead or to become successful.
Yeah.
Or maybe your job forces you to be a specific way. And to be able to navigate between that and really clearly see your landscape, we always say like, there's power in clarity, right? There's power in clarity. When you actually have a clear picture of between what your nature, nurture, and choices are, you're going to basically be able to start to choose a pathway that really allows you to tap into your flow state versus moving in a place that's unnatural to you that often will zap your energy. And at the end of the day, you wonder why you hate your job.
Yeah.
And so I went through that journey of really self-awareness to the point of like almost self-loathing of my own and not really accepting who I am, and then all of a sudden start to really embrace and really love who I am,
Right.
and then really start to then make intentional choices to live very differently. And so it takes a while, and most people don't take enough time to really go through that self-awareness journey.
Before we move on, I know people listening to the podcast who have never attended a class, we quickly went through those voices. I thought it'd be maybe helpful if we can just briefly break down each of the voices so that those listening can kind of maybe identify it while they're driving their car or just listening.
Sure. So we like to say out of the 5 voices, there are quieter voices and louder voices. We like to start with the quieter ones. And the quieter ones don't necessarily mean that they speak softly in terms of the audible level. But what we like to say is how much do they tend to impose their values and their preferences onto other people. So nurturers, they're the softest ones because they tend to create the most psychological safety and emotional comfort for other people. So we like to say if your tendency is that you see people that are hurt or people need something and you want to help them, but you're okay the way they are and where they are, and maybe they're just sharing with you their life story or whatever things that they need from you, and you love to give it to them and be a part of that life in that way, emotionally, then your tendency is to probably have a nurturer voice. And that might be your primary foundational voice, we say. The second one we call is creative. And creatives are people that see the world of how it should be and how it could be. And so there's this integrity nature that they have, like, hey, we can make this better. And so internally, they're constantly thinking. They're constantly looking at the world, analyzing it, and what can they do to make it better. But internally for themselves, they also see, like, what could they do to be a better person? And they have a hard time not only communicating those thoughts in their head because there's so much in it, but they also have a hard time accepting who they are because they always can see what they could do to be better. And we call them creatives. They're out-of-the-box thinkers. Like, standard way of doing things is not good enough. It could always be done better. The third one is, it's almost contrary to the creative voice, but it's similar to the nurturer voice in terms of they want to create stability. And so we call them guardians. How do we create stability in the processes of how we do things? And how do we honor the past decisions that everybody else decided and not think of out-of-the-box ways to do things? Because if we do, it might jeopardize the results that we know can already happen. So that diligence of doing things in a processed way that is repeatable and systematized is one of the things that they do. So opposite of the creative, but almost like a nurturer is like, hey, if it ain't broke, let's not fix it because I know what the outcome is and it's something that we all agree to. That would be guardians, right? The fourth one is what we call a connector. A connector, it tends to be extroverted because they like making relationships with people. They're all about other people and what can they do to help other people. So you find this tendency that they want to get in other people's business and they tend to air their laundry out for everybody to see is one way to say it. But they're constantly on social media. They have a Twitter account. They have a Facebook account. They have a Snapchat account. You know, they have all these accounts. But in general, right, connectors are people that want to work with other people and help other people to achieve their goals. And their meaning of life is to make other people happy in a way and improve them. And then lastly, we call them pioneers, and they tend to have the loudest voice because they are what we call the ones that possess military intelligence in a way. They're all about competency. They're about getting things done. They're the people that really say, if there's a 1 in a billion chance to do it, sign them up because there's a chance to do it. No one else has done it before, and that's very important to them. They're very good at scaling what the goal is supposed to be from the outcome to the current time, place, and creating a systematic way that other people can follow. So for them, if today, after a long day of work, but it was very vital for them to achieve a certain goal and do some processes, even though they might be physically tired, they can push themselves to get it done because it's so important to do that. But on the downside is they could really tax the people that are following them because they're not unable to keep up because they're not as compelled as the pioneers are to follow along. So in a framework, we say we all have the ability to do all 5. We just tend to do the ones that we prefer more as one foundational voice, and then how those 5 voices are ordered can tell you about like what are some other key elements about your weakness, your blind spot, and how do you prefer to use the other voices to help you through your foundational voice.
I had a question. So, Abraham, you mentioned how when you were kind of going through your own process and trying to figure out what's my dominant voice? Because as you went through them, again, I'm like, now I'm questioning myself again, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh, I definitely feel like I'm a nurturer.
Yeah.
I definitely am a connector. I also am I like to be creative. Like I love those three descriptions. I feel like it's a magnet.
Yeah.
Abraham, can you kind of talk about like, what do you do when you kind of feel like a strong pull towards several of these different voices?
Well, definitely. I think sometimes people who do resonate with a connector or nurturer, first of all, just let's take you as an example. The difference between the nuance between a nurturer and a connector is that nurturers can just embrace people, and if they don't even want to change, they're okay with just empathetically walking with them and hand-holding through the junk and through the mess. Whereas connectors tend to like want change, and if they're not willing to change and continue to go into the positive outlook of growth, then it's hard for them to maintain those relationships. Connectors tend to have also even more of a breadth of relationship, whereas nurturers tend to be faithful and often have friends that are actually from even elementary, and they keep following up with them. So that's a different nuance of it. So if that's the question, I would say, hey, do you tend to, when you love on people or care for them, do you tend to have like a magical experience and it's like great, and all of a sudden it's this wonderful catalytic counseling session and then you like break through? Or do you tend to be this faithful, endearing, forever type of person that continues to walk with them through the thick and thin? Which one do you?
Man, those descriptions are really good too. Because I mean, okay, so I'll tell you that I would hope that I'm the type that is going to stick with my friends through the thick and the thin. And I think that that's the way I am. At my heart, my core, because I do care for people. And so I want to be there for them. So I definitely would say that I probably lean more towards the nurturing side.
But then it's also like what Abe was saying, where you have to be self-aware enough to distinguish between what I want to be perceived as and what I actually am.
That's true.
Like I also want to be perceived as someone who's going to stick through the thick and thin, but am I? No. I probably wouldn't.
And that doesn't make you bad.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's so important for us to be aware, like we have all five voices, but the reality is if you don't see what your primary voice is, because it's all subjective to your mind, and we don't have this universal language that we can all talk through and share objectively of what we see, then we tend to be blind, and other people see us as being self-aware. So, the question it would be is like, well, you see yourself as a nurturer, but nobody else sees you as a nurturer because they don't see the times when you're not as patient as a nurturer would be. And we're not using the gold standard of how we measure ourselves to like a true nurturer, but measuring how we want to say that we're patting ourselves in the back and we're saying good enough. Then that's when it's almost like you're walking around and people are looking at you, man, Mike, like you can't see how you're not as nurturing and you're bragging about something that you're really not, then that repels people away from you. So our goal with Five Voices in teaching this is like, how can you become more an effective leader? Because you have clarity and objectivity of what type of leadership that you portray. What are your strengths, and lean into that, right? And I think a lot of connectors have a hard time not realizing they're not a nurturer. But for me, like I'm what we call a fourth voice nurturer, and your fourth voice tends to be your blind spot. We know your fifth voice is your weakest one, and we tend to work on it because we know that's our weak point. So it's almost like I know I got to work on that because I'm bad at it. But the fourth one is like we're just not as good as we think we are, so we call that our blind spot. And just like in your car, you have that blind spot, and you change lanes, and sometimes you almost hit that car. What happens is, for me as a fourth voice nurturer, I want to help other people, and I totally want to do things for them. But like Abraham said, like I'm someone that wants to see growth in them. And if I don't see growth, then I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so tiring.
Yeah.
And then that's when I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not a nurturer, right? Because if I was a nurturer, I'd be so happy with who they are today. But that's why I do coaching, right? I'm just naturally someone that can help people to change. And if that change doesn't happen, my tendency is to undermine my own influence, that I start over-promising and under-delivering because like, oh my gosh, we'll do it, we could do it, like you could totally make it, right? So I need to be self-aware that, hey, I am not so nurturing, so I'm gonna be more upfront with the people that I want to work with and make sure that they understand that, hey, our engagement is I wanna help you to move forward, but if that's not something that you wanna do, like more than happy to have one or two conversations and tell you where I stand, but if it's gonna take more than that, let me get you in contact with a nurturer and give you like somebody that is really good at what their strengths are, not an imposter like myself.
As you were chatting, I was thinking about how we build our teams and as we choose people to work with, So my wife, as you described, my wife is definitely a guardian.
Mm-hmm.
Like she handles all the bills. She's like managing everything. She's the one who's questioning every financial decision.
Yes.
She wants frameworks. My sister-in-law is the same way.
Yeah.
Like they're just really, really good. And I'm like the opposite. I'm very
Yeah.
much like, let's just go and get this thing. We don't need to do all the research. It'll be fine. They sell it at Costco. It'll be fine. We can take it back.
Yeah.
So we're very much opposites, so it works really well. Like it works really well for our marriage. But I'm curious about, as we build our teams, should we be finding our polar opposites to be with us as we're working on projects? I'm just kind of curious your view on that.
Yeah. Well, just a little feedback. Often we marry people opposite of ourselves in earlier years in our 20s. But as we kind of progress and get married, maybe in the 30s or 40s, you tend to kind of marry more like your voice.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's some intuitive sense where everyone kind of wants to marry the complementary gifts of who we are. We always say that if you actually have a team that's five-voiced, or at least validate or value five voices, whether you either recruit for them or actually bring them as an advisory role to give you insight, it's important to have all five voices because it really touches the full spectrum of the population.
Yeah, I like that philosophy because even when you guys were going over the voices and just looking at all their traits, I was still under the belief that pioneers are like the best leaders, because they're the ones that are so most obvious are like our leaders. So I think it's really interesting that it's like, no, you should have all five voices. Even if like it's harder to access one, you should kind of be able to tap into each to become a good leader.
Yeah.
So I really like that philosophy.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if there was a moment in your careers where you thought like something has to be different, like this has to change, and like it kind of catapulted you into the direction of the five voices.
For me, there was a moment when I got married at the age of 40, a little bit of a late bloomer. And we teach that intentionality versus accidental leadership is so vital, right? And we talked about today, there's a tool called the Know Yourself to Lead Yourself tool, that our reality, when you back calculate it, is a consequence of our actions. And so we can create the reality we want. We just have to be intentional the things that we do. And for me, getting married at 40, I knew what my wife was going to be like, and I knew my own tendencies, right? So if I know my tendencies and the things that I prefer, I could either be accidental in my actions and then become a victim of the situation and the circumstances and be a victim of my reality, or I could be intentional in what I do. And that's where five voices really came into line. Like I was using MBTI in my leadership, as I mentioned earlier, but when I found Giant and the five voices framework, they're pretty much the same backbone, but it was more intuitive and more easier for me to lay out and use and then replicate that not only in just the people that are closer to me, but also to spread that into the ecosystem of the culture, the other people that I work with. So the people in my community that I work with, they know five voices and they're able to lead their own selves to a reality that we all agree that we want to achieve, right? And then understand that balance of working with your opposite voices and having all five represented. And if we don't have that one, what would they say? What would they want in order for that to happen? And so that was really vital for me, is that when I was looking at becoming more intentional in my career, it's like, hey, I'm going to have, I had my daughter at the age of 43, right? Like my first child. I need to be so much more intentional with that because I don't have that much bandwidth. I have a 43-year-old and now I'm 46 to be able to hang with a daughter. For me to be accidental in my life, I'm constantly fixing my reality, trying to fix like my daughter's reality and then fix the relationship of my wife because I'm being accidental, but just to lean into more intentionality so that I'm a lot more effective and efficient with the relationships that I have.
I think for me, I think it's so powerful when you are able to start to understand the value of each voice, right? And I think for me as a pioneer, one of the tendencies that they tend to have is that they like to execute really fast. And sometimes if it's no one understands you, you just kind of pioneer away, you kind of hack away, and what ends up happening, you might accomplish great things, but I found myself when I looked to my left and my right, I was like, no one was celebrating with me.
Right.
Because I did it, but I conquered that mountain by myself, and I didn't do it with a team. And so I kept doing this in different reiterations in my career, in different aspects, in different organizations, and I realized, oh my gosh. If I want to continue to do great things, but then do it by myself because I want to do it fast, I said, hey, you can do it fast if you do it alone. But if you want to do something greater and bigger and actually enjoy the process, celebrate it, then do it, slow down a little bit and to do it together. And that's what has been really transformative for me as a pioneer is like, hey, I give a practical example, even walking. I walk so fast compared to my wife, who is a nurturer, who
She's like,
literally
"Hello?"
soaks in the presence of the environment, and she just
Yeah.
enjoys. She literally looks at every single thing. And I realized, oh my gosh, like that's what I do literally to other voices, right? Like certain voices like to take things a little bit slower, right? Sometimes they even feel like they often are putting brakes to your projects. Whereas other voices tend to like push on the
Right.
acceleration, which is typically the creatives, the pioneers, and the connectors. But nurturers and guardians tend to do it a little bit slower because they adopt new concepts a different way because their gift set is bringing stability in relationships for the nurturer and stability in operations and consistency for the guardians. And so if we don't value each person, then we're not going to actually have fun at the end and celebrate. And in the day and age where you realize that if you really want to do your best and bring the best product or service, you got to do it not by yourself, but you got to learn how to work in teams. And really those who actually have the EQ and the sense to actually work collaboratively can do greater things than actually by yourself. And so that's something that's really been a huge learning opportunity for me and has really changed the way that I've actually conducted myself.
That's really good. That's a really good example of like how a pioneer should be working across these different voices. How about the other end of the spectrum where you have the nurturers on the team and they want to make an impact too, but sometimes it's harder. They have the quieter voice and it's harder for them to maybe get the attention of the pioneer on the team or whoever's leading the team. And do you have any advice for them to help them seem more credible and also be able to help influence decisions?
One thing you mentioned earlier was how do you create representation of all the different voices on a team, and is that the wise way to do it? And I think a lot of times the limitation of the leader's ability to work across all five voices eventually becomes the glass ceiling of the capabilities of that leader and the team. So if I take that the other way around and say, as a nurturer voice that tends to be more quiet, when it's exhausting emotionally and it's physically exhausting to engage with a pioneer and have a difference of opinions, but then your tendency is to always come from the perspective of emotional safety, whereas the complete opposite for the pioneer, that their tendency is to drive for competency and achievement, then you have to know what you're up against. And you don't want to like go to war and not count the cost of what it's going to take to battle, and then eventually lose, and then be perceived as someone that is incompetent, right? But what we also want to say is nurturers, knowing that the person that you're working with is a pioneer and is someone that drives for competency, and we have all five voices. Like you should see a nurturer when they become a pioneer, it tends to be when they're really tired and they're fighting for all the people they care for, and then someone starts picking on like their family. Like you should see, like if someone were to pick on my daughter, my wife that's a nurturer, like oh my God. Mama Bear comes out and becomes like the pioneer mom, right?
Yeah.
And so you have that in you, but let's not wait till the last moment when you're so exhausted and you're so tired, and then now you feel like the pioneer is trying to pick on all the people on your team that you care about, that you kind of come out, right? What we're saying is save that energy into a positive way and be more intentional and do your homework, right? Take the time to get to know the pioneer, what their goals are, what are their preferences, do some research to say what is the best way to move forward, and not only share that, but also don't be afraid to represent your group, because we say nurturers are 43% of the general population. They have the most representation. So if you want diversity, equity, and inclusion in the leadership scope, nurturers have the most, not only to provide because you represent so much, but you also have the most to lose if you don't speak up. So I think it's very important that they push themselves to engage in that level and really bring out that mama bear ahead of time and go to toe to toe. It's going to be tiring after the conversation, but with practice, you can really use that strength more and more.
as you've consulted at different companies and met with different types of leaders, do you notice certain trends towards certain types of voices for certain types of, for leaders? Aside from, I'm thinking like pioneer to me is like the obvious one, like strategy, the drive, setting goals, let's go team. Like that one seems like, okay, that seems like a natural kind of leader role. But I'm curious about other types of voices you see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just more in general, for instance, nurturers tend to have a natural bent towards HR, right? You have the financial CPA or the operations tend to be a little more guardian. You have the salesperson tend to be a little bit more of a connector, typically. And then you have maybe the marketing could be also connector or creative, some aspects, right? So there's usually some like natural tendencies to certain jobs that maybe you have chemistry with naturally. But we find that the future-oriented voices, typically the pioneer connectors and creatives, tend to be in a little bit higher levels of positions because they like to look at the bigger picture. They don't want to be in the day-to-day operations. And we often find the present-oriented voices, the nurturers and guardian, tend to be a little bit in more of the actual individual contribution or the people management aspects of it because they like to have things more concrete in the day-to-day operations. They don't want to just go into theory of the big picture. And so we do see a little bit of a correlation of what we find is you'll see a little more of the future voices, the pioneer connector creators up on the higher levels. Not that they are only competent, but that typically they like to kind of shoot for those things because that's where it kind of brings out their genius more. Whereas nurturers, guardians tend to not want to go above because they like to just be more in the hands-on daily activities even more so because they don't want to go into a place where it just becomes so ethereal. Yeah.
So like one way to look at it is like risk aversion, right? So guardians and nurturers don't tend to like risk. So the higher up you go, the more risky it is for not only their own livelihood, because there's a lot more eyeballs on them, and they have a tendency to not want to draw that attention. And then at the same time, they're so much more detail-oriented. It's so hard for them to manage all aspects of the business. And as Abraham was saying, they don't like the conceptual aspects of a job. And so they want to just be in the day-to-day aspects, right? But then you'll find most pioneers tend to be more on the higher executive level because they're willing to fight those type of battles that they have. So they're people that are very strategic and long-term. So larger corporations, upper management tends to be more pioneeristic, we would like to say. And then you find the creatives and the connectors right below them when it comes to like director level or senior management type of positions as well, because they like to work with other people and they can take this conceptual architecture and start speaking that into the different teams that they're leading so that we can drive towards a certain goal.
Yeah. But I don't want to pigeonhole and just say that nurturers and guardians cannot be at the highest level. There are great leaders in that move in that, but what we find there's a trend because of the natural gift sets where they want to kind of position themselves in the career path. Yeah.
I know that we tap into our different voices depending on the situation and who we're talking to, but do our foundational voices ever change, like in different times of our lives?
So our foundational voice will never change. It'll always be true, your natural voice.
Okay.
But there's different seasons in life because of different areas that you need to grow in maturity. You may actually have to elevate different aspects of your life. So if you're a connector, you tend to love to cast vision. You're really good with chemistry with people and socializing ideas and branding and communication. But maybe something that you had to learn through your maturity of your growth is learning how to execute and deliver what you promised. And so that might be something of a guardian tendency. So a mature connector would actually be able to exercise their guardian voice so they can actually follow through with the things that they actually sold or communicated. Or that they would supplement their leadership voice with the right recruitment of guardian voices to supplement any of their weakness, per se.
So it's not like Myers-Briggs, because Myers-Briggs you can change, right? Like throughout your life. Don't you like change your letters?
So I would say is most people do, so with any tools and assessments, there's always a nature, nurture, and choice component. When people do the Myers-Briggs, they often combine all of that and they think that's who they are. But the reality is if you really do it with regards to your nature, it's very predictive.
Right.
It's everyone has a certain Myers-Briggs type, I believe, by nature, but they're very unaware sometimes. That's why they say they always change. But the reality is there's a common theme of who they are, but they filtered it because of different nurturing elements.
Things are happening. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Well, I feel like I'm not very good at diagnosing myself with this area. So I'm curious, like a leader is listening to this podcast, they hear the different voices, and now they're beginning to think about the people on their team and be able to like almost assign, oh, this person's definitely the guardian on my team. This person definitely seems like a nurturer. And so as you were talking, I was like thinking about my family and going, oh, my daughter's like this, my wife's like this. But they might see themselves differently, right? So I'm kind of curious, like, how do you deal with like this whole voice thing when we think we're a certain way?
Yeah.
But if you were looking at me, talking to me, you'd be like, no, Mike, actually, you're more this way. And this is where it gets really hard, the subjective side of it, because I'm feeling a strong pull towards a certain voice, but then you might see another voice in me. How do you kind of deal with that?
For sure.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, but
So like the way I would look at it is I never try to fix or contradict people per se, unless they really want me to do so. But I think what I tend to do is if I perceive guardian behavior from you, Mike, I want to respond to you as if you were a guardian because I want to meet you where you are. A lot of times under stress, like we go from our natural voice to a different voice based upon what are those conditions around us, right? And we actually end up in our opposite voice in extreme stress. So if you're a ENTP, right, in extreme stress, you will act like an ISFJ. So if that's the case, then I want to meet you as an ISFJ, calm you down so you're not so inflamed, and then respond to you again as an ENTP. And then what I've done is built a relationship with you. I care more about the relationship between us and your ability to perform rather than me being right and pushing myself onto you, right? So we talked about relational safety, right? Being able to become an influential leader, not necessarily using my authority and say, hey, I know Myers-Briggs more than you. Mike, you're totally wrong. And you're not going to be like, well, what am I going to get from you, right?
Yeah.
So we call that resistive leadership, where it really comes off arrogant. And you're not going to want to work with me. And even though you're wrong and later on you realize it, you're not going to even come back to him and say, hey, Jim, you know what? You were totally right. I'm wrong, right? No, you're like, well, I don't want to work with him because he just seemed arrogant, right? He just seemed like someone that just a know-it-all, and he's just somebody that, you know, if I'm really tired, like he's not going to be someone that's going to energize me. So what we want to say is we want to be responsive leaders. Like it takes humility from me. It's like, oh, that's fine. But I know what the truth is going to be, and I'll let you discover that at your time. But I need you to go through that journey so that you become more self-aware and then you become a better leader because I was a better leader for you. So we saw responsive leadership. Hey, if you think you're a guardian or you're exhibiting guardian behavior, but I think he's really a nurturer, then hey, let's be a guardian. Like I'll take care of you. I'll meet you where you are and allow you to feel comfortable. And then usually, again, when the stress comes down, you'll go back to your natural self.
Self-awareness is a journey. And we never graduate from it, we always say. And typically what we find is that if you can have a process and you have feedback loops of quantitative and qualitative assessments, and people quickly, I mean, you may assume yourself to, for instance, be a connector, right? Mm-hmm. But for another person, it might be like, hey, actually, I perceive you as this in the leadership. So it's always good to always be a leader who wants to get feedback from people. It's like, hey, this is my perception, but how have you guys experienced me, right? And as you do that, you'll start to see a trend. You'll start to see a pattern. And usually people at home really see the real you even more so. And so they would often tell you the truth. And so the beauty of the 5 voices is that it's such a simple framework. It's very intuitive that the best frameworks are simple, and then it can scale into every context so that you can actually have the right feedback. I say don't adopt like hundreds of different assessments. Like don't do like, I'm gonna use MBTI, Enneagram, and all these like colors and animals, and like, well, just pick one framework
Animals.
and really start to like have objectivity to the subjective experience that you have, and invite others to that framework as well, because then they can start to give you objective feedback in light of that similar framework. But if it's too complex of a framework, then it's hard for others to play with it. So we always say, hey, find whatever's simple, start to engage with it. And then obviously if there's a coach or a process or visual tools that help you to kind of audit where you are and give some objective understanding to your situation, that really helps with the process. Yeah.
Yeah, as you're chatting, I was thinking about, there's a very famous book by Gary Chapman called The Five Love Languages. And this is very similar, like learning to speak that right voice, that right language to the right person so it's understood.
Yeah.
It's funny, we're coming up with Valentine's Day, and my wife always says, don't get me flowers, don't get me candy, don't spend any money. She's very frugal. But also, like those types of things, the money, the flowers, these chocolates, like that really means nothing to her.
Yeah.
Like that's not love at all. What she wants is action, like
service,
action
right?
speak service.
As a guardian.
Yeah, so like, so my Valentine's gift to her is like, I'm gonna clean the house thoroughly.
Yep.
Like, get up early, I'll be in the bathroom scrubbing. Like, to her, that is love.
Yeah.
Like, putting in the work, not just, love you, sweetie. Because the easy thing to do would be get flowers, get chocolate.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty easy for me to do.
Yeah.
But to her, that's like, thanks, but she wants to see
Action.
service,
Yeah.
Let's start with the areas that she has to interact with. So like whether it's the bedroom first, whether it's the garage first, like the time that it makes her more efficient is just, that's love, And like my wife's a nurturer. For her, it's just spending time with her and cuddling. Like she's just emotional safety, right?
Yeah.
I want to go do stuff. Like let's go to this amusement park. Let's do this, let's do that. And she's just so drained after, right? And so, she likes flowers every once in a while, but it's like this Valentine's Day, it's just gonna be family time, and I have nothing planned except for one thing. And if we just do that one thing, like I just have to check that off my box and we're good, But it's just, just understand, like, how do we make it so that people want to spend time with us on Valentine's Day, not necessarily, oh my gosh, positional authority, Valentine's Day forces us to have to spend time with each other.
Oh my God.
I don't want to do this anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's a traumatic experience for other people.
Right. Can you share, each of you, some examples of how these different voices, that framework has actually helped you in business?
Yeah. I would say for me, in your voice, you'll find that your two weakest voices are often missing sometimes intentionally in your business. And so if let's say your top voice order is connector, usually a secondary one would be creative. Your two lower voices would be typically nurture and guardian, nurture being more of a blind spot. Well, a nurture guardian system would be customer service and follow through, and then SOPs and operations. And I can easily tell you right away exactly what are your pain points and what you haven't really intentionally built out. Because what you're really good at is probably like connecting away, selling and branding and communicating your message, and maybe creating fun, valuable, celebratory type of teamwork. But when it comes to the follow-up and the execution and the consistency and the boring, monotonous activity, the day-to-day it might be really hard for you as a connector. And that's actually across the board for every connector. And so that's really fascinating, that is because most people aren't aware of that. And because if they're not aware of it, they're not going to really then be intentional to building that out to make the full five-voice kind of business. Yeah.
And that's actually like really good advice for those leaders that are doing performance reviews for their employees. Like knowing those voices can really help them to find those areas. Oh yeah, they are weaker in those particular areas.
Yeah.
Kind of pivoting the conversation a little bit, how are you guys modeling good leadership to your kids?
So for me, and I talked about being intentional in my patterns of behavior and my actions with my family so that I can create the reality I want. I want my daughter to be an influential leader as well. And I want my relationship with my wife to be something that she could see and emulate what I'm doing with her and what my wife is doing with me, so that she can model that type of behavior, healthy behavior with her friends and take it everywhere, right? I want her to have her subjective experience be objectively learned through our intentionality with her. So for my one daughter that's turning 2 this Friday, a lot of it is I just know what her tendencies are. And I'm pretty sure I know what her voice order is, but I just also know like what are the tendencies that she isn't good at, and manage my expectations for her to do those things. And I also know what are the things that she favors from, and I give that to her when the timing is right. So I don't spoil her with doing all the things that she loves to do and just being something that she always wants to come from me for. But I also challenge her in a way so that she's growing in the aspects that she doesn't naturally like to do. So for example, my daughter is a very spontaneous girl that has a lot of fun. She doesn't tend to be someone that voices her opinion, so I think she might be a nurturer. But she's also one of those that is kind of like happy-go-lucky. So what I need to do is I need to lead her into a reality of success and know that she takes a lot of time to clean up. But I also know when the signs are that she's getting tired, right? I naturally want to have more and more fun with her because that's my tendency. But instead, I have to say, hey, like, sweetie, it's time out. It's time to clean up. And I make cleaning up a game that's relational for me. So she's learning the cleanup skills and then clean up in a time that she is not too exhausted to want to clean up. And then realize that if she is too tired, that's my fault that I didn't set that time frame up right for her. And then I will maybe carry her around with me and I want her to see me cleaning up. But cleaning up is not an option, right? But I will help you to make that happen together. And I'm slowly developing those skills that she doesn't naturally want to do so that she can be a lot more ambidextrous in her leadership. She can be a pioneer later on because she can fight through those challenges and she's seen that, as well as she could be herself when she wants to be herself and enjoy that joy too.
I think sometimes what we're not aware of as parents is that we often try to impose in light of who we are and think that we need to conduct ourselves and teach them that modeling. But the reality is that you might actually have a child that's actually an opposite of who you are, right? And the reason why you have chemistry with certain children in your family is because they probably carry either maybe your primary or secondary voice. And those ones that actually really stress you out might be almost opposite of who you are. And so I think for me, understanding this with my wife, literally I married my nemesis voice. As a pioneer, I married a nurturer, right? And I realized, wow, her at her just rest state, just being herself, it actually stresses me out when and vice versa.
Yeah.
But now it's funny because now since I see that the uniqueness and the beauty of that voice itself, I realize she's not trying to stress me out on purpose or trying to be like malicious. She's just being herself.
Right. It's
funny when you often fall in love with people that are things that often are very different from you, but often that becomes the very thing that actually
annoys you.
But now with this five voice framework, I see the beauty and like, I start to laugh at it. It's like, oh my God, you're totally being just you. Where before I would have been like so annoyed, right?
Why are you being like this?
Yeah, and it's life changing for even my kids because I imagine some of you may have had more of that militaristic, maybe guardian, like you got to do it this way, or a pioneering type of parent who pushes their agenda, and that could be very difficult for some other voices within the family that maybe are very different. And I think for us to be able to know how to nurture them or support them or challenge them in light of who they are is very important. This is very important in the context of family, but all these skill sets actually translate over into people management as well.
Right.
So I have an exercise I would like to ask you guys to do. So let's just say that this is like a practical one, like team meetings. Like we have meetings all the time, and it's really important that we hear from the different people on the team. All their opinions matter. So the exercise is you're leading a team meeting as a pioneer, and you have all five voices present in that room. I was wondering if you can maybe just share how you would talk to each of them about an upcoming project.
For sure. I mean, as a pioneer, I think definitely we always say, pioneer, shut up. You have the loudest voice, so you need to listen. And I say the real motivation for you to shutting your mouth is because if you don't get the right data, you can't make the best decision. And because the force of your impact, your voice is so loud, you need to actually be silent and learn to not push your agenda, but actually pull the genius of all of your people. And because pioneers are super loud, they often silence the rest of the room, and often their idea usually wins. So we often say to them, be quiet, listen, pull, starting with the nurture, right? Allow them to speak, don't critique them, but really validate and create that safety for them. And then from there, we say, hey, creatives, let them forecast into the future what potential pitfalls and opportunities that they can kind of have that spidey sense into the future. And then when you don't understand, clarify, ask questions for that. And then we can say, hey, from there, let guardians talk about any of their interrogating kind of questions that they have with regards to their gatekeeping in regards to certain agendas of things. And we say, if you allow them if you invite them to those critiquing questions or specific detailed questions, they will actually feel honored and respected, and they will think of all the monster list of things that you need to do to really execute on the idea. We say to the connectors, hey, if you're passionate about something, go sell it for all it's worth and be passionate, right? Because you're going to naturally be able to bring the energy to the group, but also you're going to naturally bring in all of the ideas of how to message it, how to connect all the people and resources and recruit them for this specific agenda. And then when you actually have all that idea from all the 4 voices, then you have everything that you need to then collect that as a pioneer, get all the different alignment of people and resources and all the data to actually make them the best solution to win as a team. And so I think that would probably be the most ideal situation moving forward as a pioneer.
I love that.
As a pioneer, it must be hard for you to be able to tell yourself, be quiet, right? Just like what you said, right? How do you achieve that kind of self-awareness, and how do you practice that continually so that you don't fall back into, your typical pioneer traits or your typical creative or typical nurturer traits?
Yeah. I think it all goes into knowing yourself to lead yourself. And if you start to realize a certain reality and a certain fruit of kind of how things go in regards to the team communication, then you have to really see, wow, if there's not much communication of flowing back and forth and exchange of it, there must be something with regards to my own leadership. Maybe me have not created a safe place, I've not pulled enough from them, or maybe stated a common ground where people feel like they can bring in their contribution. And so I think that's where you kind of have to come to the reality and start to adjust differently.
I have a last question.
Yeah, fine.
I think this discussion has been really, really helpful, and I love just kind of the theme around self-awareness. And I was wondering if you guys could talk about what you do to constantly keep yourself self-aware.
This is a hard one, and I think this is the blind spot everybody has. Abraham and I like to say that the blind spot that we constantly have, which you can see in your 4th voice, but it's really is the inability to realize what other people hear you saying and what you think you're saying, right? And it's literally being vulnerable to allow other people to speak in your life, and the people that you really trust, for them to talk to you openly and honestly, and allow that safety for you to realize, I don't know everything, and I don't feel everything, and I need you to provide that time to me. So there's a tool that we teach, it's called the Developing Others tool, and it's how do you develop other people. And in that, there's 3 components that we say it's important. You need to have consistent formal time, but also need to create access for informal time. There needs to be also short-term vision and long-term vision. What does this relationship look like now, and what do you want for this relationship long-term? And then as well as let me know through encouragement. We like to say leaders call each other up, not call each other out. And I want you to call me up to what you think and what I'm trying to be, not just always provide critique and call me out to what I want to be. But if you have, for me, it's I have 5 people in my life that I call my personal board of directors.
Oh, I like that.
And they don't know that they're on my board of directors, but I have consistent conversations with them. I tell them what I need to hear. I tell them my situation. I ask them to give me feedback of what they think, knowing me, what probably really happened, right? And I ask them hey, do you mind if we can have this conversation again, or can I text you, or can I, check in with you on some other things that happens, and just have that open line of communication. And then have that short-term expectation and long-term expectation of what we want from this relationship. And as well as, what are the things that you think I could do better, and how can you call me up so that I can become more self-aware and somebody that people want to follow, versus just being somebody that people have to follow. and then I'm not providing that responsiveness to them. And that's been really helpful to me, just to have that 5 board of directors.
I love that. That is so beautiful.
I just want to end the conversation on like a fun note, but I really love talking about this with you guys. So I'd love for you guys to take turns applying the voice to a popular character in pop culture right now, or like even history or wherever. Starting maybe with like nurturer and then creative and then, yeah.
Jim's really good at this.
I know.
He literally analyzes movies and kind of breaks it down. What's a popular movie or kind of show that I think people can all resonate and kind of attribute a stereotypical voice to them? Yeah.
We were talked about This Is Us as one. I don't know if that's something that's ubiquitous.
We talked
from
about
everybody.
This Is Us, Marvel.
Marvel.
What else did we talk about? I think those are the 2 big things we talked about.
Yeah, I think like so Avengers might be one that's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So going for the nurture in the Avengers, you might not see this, but Captain America, I think he's a nurture guardian kind of a character, almost similar to Superman, right? Like Clark Kent. Clark Kent would be more of a nurture. Like he just cares for people, puts himself in harm's way. He's not trying to fix things, but he's fighting for justice so that people have safety in where they are. And I think that's something that I saw with Captain America, right? He is that patriotic American way. Nobody hates him. You can't hate him. He's so nice. But he's never trying to change other people. He's just defending people.
Right, that's right.
That's actually the perfect example of like, the Winter Soldier, and you were saying if someone doesn't change, nurturers stick with them,
Yep,
like no
to the
matter
very
what.
end.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Good example. That's a really good example.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Creative, who would you say?
Creative would
Bruce
be
Banner, Hulk.
Yeah, Bruce Banner, Hulk, or even Batman.
Yeah.
It would be a creative figure.
They're always idealistic of how things ought to be. They're always trying to make the world a better place. And so maybe Bruce Banner is just experimentation, all his science that he was. And then with Batman, right, just really calm, really nice guy, kind of a goofy, fun-loving person. That playboy image it's not really as much of the creative voice, but it is like he has that secret identity of Batman where he has all these like tools, like technology. Creatives are very early adopters of technology and try to do things differently. So, but then you cross them, you do them wrong, like Batman turns into Hulk. So we say creatives tend to Hulk out as one of their weapons. And then even for Batman, you could see like when he's really upset and he's really defending for that justice and what Gotham City is supposed to be for his hometown and that vengeance for his parents, and he's trying to right that wrong. I think that's it.
That
Spider-Man, I
sense of
think, is
big
also
bent for justice. Yeah.
yeah, and I think Spider-Man could be also a creative voice in that way too. Then who do you have next?
Iron
The
Man.
Guardian?
Iron Man, I think maybe be pioneer.
Yeah, Pioneer.
He's always thinking
I
about
see that.
scaling. I mean, you see that scaling his business and kind
Right.
of always entrepreneur new
Right.
things and pushing the agenda. Yeah.
That's good.
Who's a Guardian?
Guardian consistency. Let's see. Huh.
Guardians don't tend to come out a lot in comics, I think, just because they're the opposite of connectors. So connectors tend to be like the life of the party, right?
Right.
The connectors tend to be like the person in the background that makes sure that everything is done and it's done consistently, done well. So
Oh, it's going to be the butler. In Batman.
I was going to say Alfred, maybe,
Alfred.
right, in a way?
Maybe.
Or just someone, he comes off very serving, but he's like, no, he's telling Bruce Wayne what to do, what's wrong, like how he needs to do something differently is one way to look at it. So it's having that posture of like what are the systems that he ought to do to minimize the risk of him coming back to the mansion and like killing himself, right?
Yeah.
He's constantly worried about that type of a risk, that death that we have. And then connector.
This is really good.
I know. I love it.
I'm trying to Marvel Universe or DC Universe. I'm trying to pitch something, always do something. I think, from from Guardians of the Galaxy, Star-Lord.
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 Total connector, right? He brings all these people
Yeah.
around him to help him out, but he's totally music, like the life of the party, always cracks jokes a little bit, right? I think Star-Lord would
Doesn't
definitely
take
be it.
feedback very well.
Take it personally.
Okay, well,
Critique.
that's it. You don't have any more questions, right?
That was really good.
Okay, thank you guys
All right.
for
Thank you.
giving us your time, even though
Thank
you've been
you.
talking all day.
Oh, actually, let's record. I just want to get one more thing in.
Yeah.
For those that want to learn more about your work, can you share?
Yeah.
So we're actually, what would we actually direct them to?
Yeah, so we are independent consultants with Giant Worldwide, so we're not really employees. The way the model works is Giant Worldwide is the organization, and they have, we've gone through months of training, and then from that we have the license and the ability to provide the structure and the material and train upon that. So currently, Abraham and I are working on creating a brand, because what we've tried to do is take what we do and then put this into a diversity, equity, and inclusion model, and that's what we did here at Experian, is how do we create this engagement of leadership most companies do, but provide it in a way where the power to the people, so to speak, that how do we get the non-executive levels to feel that they're empowered to be able to move up. So I think the best way for now would just be like
LinkedIn would be a great way.
LinkedIn is a good way, yeah. So
Yeah, Abraham Jin, and you can look me up, type up, Giant. You should probably find us there. And I think you can look up Jim Lee as well, and
Yeah.
you should be able to find
We'll
us there.
definitely link you guys too.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, they can go ahead and look in the description and contact you guys.
And we definitely want to encourage you, Mike, you were kind of hinting at this as well as for you, Patty, just we can't stress the importance of self-awareness, because the less self-aware you are, and as much as you think you're aware, you're probably not. And there are definitely casualties of bodies of people that are being undermined as well as yourself just around you. And imagine the opportunity lost that you have to be able to support more people, to be able to move your goals even further and forward, that there's less wasted time, less bumps and bruises that the people around you have to feel. And then you don't have to undermine your influence, but in fact be able to leverage your gifts and see things in a more clear way that brings other people aboard and empower others as well. So please, empower yourself, and we're more than happy to answer questions. So look us up on LinkedIn, and more than happy to respond. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Level Up.
If you'd like to see a summary of today's show, you can go to the Experian blog. The short URL is just ex.pn/levelup.
If you found any of the information today helpful, please consider supporting us by hitting subscribe or leaving us a review. Thanks for dropping in and giving us a listen, and we hope to see you again for our next episode.